Here we are entering into Q2. We're a month into the Ukraine war, and there are two specific Black Swan events that we wanted to update you on. One is the obvious war in Ukraine and how it's impacting commodities or other construction impacts that are affecting you and your projects. The second thing we want to introduce you to is, could there actually be another Black Swan event? We're watching one emerge and wanted to fill you in on it. Welcome to the PioneerCast. I'm Dwayne Abels, founder and president of Pioneer IQ. I hope over the course of the next 10 to 15 minutes, you're able to get some insights on how to develop and prepare your leaders, specific things that you might need to change in your existing strategic plan, or insights on how your market might be shifting given all the crazy things happening in our world. This topic today, I can certainly not talk about on my own. Again, we've got Keith Prather from Armada Corporate Intelligence joining us and filling us in on a couple of these key big issues. Keith, good to see you again.
Hey, good to see everybody also. Yeah, glad to be here.
Okay, so I got to tell you, it's slightly depressing just to think we need to inform our clients and our viewers on another Black Swan event. So somewhat interested, somewhat disappointed we're having to continue these types of conversations, but it's a reality, and our leaders are needing to know what they are so they can forge forward and lead on through it. So get us up to speed, Keith, on what's going on with the war in Ukraine and how that might impact specifically construction demand volumes and supply chain.
Yeah, you bet. So first of all, I'm just going to say, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, it's really tough right now to figure out sort of what is going to happen next. Yesterday is a great example. We saw in the stock market a lot of euphoria because ceasefire talks looked like they were making progress. Russia was going to pull out of Kyiv, and it looked like we were going to start to see some progress. And then not 12 hours later, what they realized is that Russian forces were just repositioning themselves. Markets back down. Volatility is still out there. So you and I don't really want to talk specifically about what's happening with the war itself, but let's talk about the impact and what's happening to companies. So let me flip over. Let me start the presentation here. If you want to pop that up for me. There we go. So first of all, now that the I won't say the dust is settled. That's not appropriate. Dust is still flying. But now that the fog of war has now lifted enough that we can kind of see what the real global impacts are, and we've let the global supply chain react, we really know that there's probably three specific areas where the war is having an impact. We're not going to focus a lot of time today on food, but just know that our hearts go out to, I think, a lot of people around the world are going to go through a really tough period over the next 12 to 14 months with food insecurity. In the United States, I mean, we're obviously blessed that, we won't go through that same situation. Food prices will be high. We're going to be disgruntled about it, but there are going to be, in some third world countries, some very, very real food shortage issues. The world's going to have to get through that. But we know that from a construction perspective, number two and number three, there are really the two big impacts. So number two, the metals impact. At first we looked, and Russia and Ukraine combined only accounted for 3 to 4% of the global market for metal exports. But when we really kind of boiled down to it, what really happened was that there were a lot of companies that were single sourcing specific metals from Ukraine or from Russia. And so all of a sudden, one of your suppliers that you're sourcing products from, all of a sudden they can't get backstock. They can't get any raw materials, and they've got to completely rethink their supply chain. So let's take copper, for instance. Okay, there was some copper supply coming out of those markets, and some plumbing suppliers were buying Ukraine copper or buying Russian copper. And what they had to do was shift. And even though there's plenty of available copper, like in South America, they've got to go place those orders. The South American miners have got to be able to produce more copper. They got to be able to get on the market, get it shipped, blah, 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 blah. So there's a big delay in that supply chain and trying to get those commodity metals to a point where we can actually then produce the products and get them delivered and put them into a construction project. So we're temporarily going through that delay, but the metals markets have already come off of their peak highs. So if you look at you look at iron ore, you look at steel, certain steel components, copper, palladium, titanium, all those different metals, you're starting to see them come off of their peaks, but they're still not coming down super fast, right? We're still 60, 70, 80% higher in prices than we were maybe a year or two ago. And so we still have a way to go before we really see metal supply and really see metal prices come down to a level where we don't see a lot of project cancellation risks. You and I were talking off camera that, you and I both are hearing from completely different sources that projects are being put on hold or being, maybe canceled, just because still can't get products, still can't get them at a price that we can afford. So that probably is one of the bigger direct construction impacts. Um, but we want to talk a little more in the rest of the presentation about one of the hidden impacts we didn't really expect to be as big as it is, but there is a growing fuel supply and price increase risk, specifically because of fuel shortages, and we'll spend a lot of more time on that. The one other thing we did want to point out, though, and this is kind of important, that emerging Black Swan event that you talked about at the opening. There is, and it's good and bad. The good is that we've seen this before. We know what it looks like. We stared it in the face last summer. But the bad is that we're going to go through it again. So China has a significant outbreak of COVID going through the country, and unlike the United States and Europe and some of the other, growing and emerging markets, where we allowed COVID to kind of go through the population, and so we built up some natural immunity to it as a population. China didn't do that. China had a zero COVID case policy, so when they would have a small outbreak, they would completely lock down that region. Well, what's happened now is that as we have new variants that go through, like Omicron, which are not as deadly to, like you and I, Dwayne, if we got Omicron, we have a scratchy throat, a little bit of a cough, but we get through it. As I hack and cough, right?
Yeah.
I've got the vid. So anyway, we get through it okay, but in those populations now, it's just sweeping. Mm-hmm. So as a result, China has gone in and started to lock down parts of Beijing and Shanghai, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and we're seeing the ripple go through those distribution systems inland, like we kind of did during the summer last year. So companies that are waiting on products, especially fixtures and things that we put into construction projects, unfortunately, we're going to go through another period of time where, it's delayed or paused. We don't know how long this is going to last. We just need to know that that's happening kind of in the background of everything else that we're talking about. So when it comes to the war in Ukraine, though, we'll see what happens. It sounds to me like at least there's some talk of eventually a ceasefire with Russia occupying probably half the country. That's when I talk to military experts, at least that's kind of what we're hearing. But in the meantime, one of the biggest factors that we're a little concerned about, and this is emerging, we're just hearing a lot about this, is what's happening to the global diesel supply. So a couple of things I want to give you as background real fast. A lot of European countries like Austria, Germany, and some other countries used to get, nearly all their diesel out of Ukraine, and they get a tremendous amount of it out of Russia. So those supplies have been completely cut off for a period of time now, and probably will be cut off for an extended period of time. Austria, a few other countries are already starting to ration diesel. So they're running out of inventory, they're running out of supplies, they're buying diesel from anywhere around the world where they can get it. So in the United States, just in the last week, we've started to see what some of the people I talk to say this is the first time in their memory we have been shipping diesel out of the Northeast. So typically this time of year, even though we're kind of coming into the spring, heaters are still on in the Northeast, temperatures are still cold overnight, we're still burning heating oil. And typically what happens then is we're still importing diesel, we're still importing raw oil to try and meet those demands. But right now, because of the crisis in Europe, we're exporting diesel. We know that there were at least 3 or 4 major tankers full of diesel filled and sent out of the Northeast, headed to Europe. Then in the Gulf of Mexico, in January, we were exporting 18,000 barrels a day of diesel out of the Gulf. And that has now ramped up in February and March to 103,000 barrels a day of diesel headed to Europe. And we think because of these shortages happening in Austria, and that the big impact of diesel shortages are just now starting to hit Europe, that will probably increase as much as it can. The result is, you can see the chart there. This is just weekly diesel inventories and a few other distillate fuels, but this is primarily diesel. And you can look and see that We just touched the lowest level of inventories, arguably since, I mean, in a statistical measure since 2014. But we really have got to go back to about 2008, 2009 to see diesel inventories this low. I think as we start to get new inventory data, you're going to see it dip below these levels, and it's going to continue downward, especially because we're exporting much faster. So the big impact of that is obviously what you would think. Diesel prices have hit all-time highs, and they continue to go higher. The one thing that I did not talk about, it was on the other slide, is that if we think about what happens in the summertime in the United States, a lot of refiners start to convert their fuel blends, and we go to summer blend fuels. And they think that with global diesel demand so high, and with those refineries already set up to deliver that kind of diesel, that at these prices, they'll continue to blow through and continue to focus their resources on building diesel output, and may not convert as quickly to summer gasoline blends. Bank of America had a big piece on this just last week, talking about this particular risk. And so that adds to U.S. domestic gasoline price risk, right? So we'll see it at the pump if we don't get those conversions to summer blends fast enough, if we don't get enough of it blending fast enough. But the other impact here is that diesel prices are going to remain high longer. So for construction companies, what we worry about is a view that FTR and Associates, this is FTR Transportation Intelligence, and they put out a chart that shows the number of trucking firms that have asked for authority to operate. And most of these are going to be small independent trucking firms. The majority of these will have between 5 and 45 trucks, so they're still fairly small firms. But what happened to us is back in 2008, when the last time diesel prices hit an all-time high, we saw 4,000 trucking companies go out of business. They went bankrupt. We had stories of drivers that were responsible for putting diesel in their own trucks, but they were driving for another company, literally parking their trucks on the side of the road, locking the keys in the truck, calling the company they worked for and said, "Hey, your truck is at I-435 and I-35, come and get it, I quit." And the cost to fuel a diesel truck now has gone from $1,200 to $2,000. And so if you're making 4 or 5 runs a week, you've got to have 5 or 10 grand sitting around that you can cash front to fuel the truck before you get paid for that invoice. And a lot of small independent drivers just don't have that kind of cash. So anyway, what we've seen then over the years, so from about 2010 through about 2019, you see this nice gradual growth of new trucking companies, very balanced, very normal growth rates. We didn't see a lot of decline. But now over the last 2 years, we've added 68,000 new trucking companies to the national capacity. And all those 68,000 are less than 2 years old. They got a lot of heavy debt. They've got a lot of heavy debt service. They've got high fuel costs now. Insurance rates have skyrocketed since 2008, and they've got a heavier labor cost. And even though they're getting pretty good prices for transportation on the other side, we think a lot of these 68,000 could be at risk. So for construction companies, sorry, you're going to say something. Go ahead.
No, you were heading the direction I was thinking. I mean, so for construction companies, this could have multiple impacts, from getting goods from the coast and the ports to projects to just the cost of their overhead for fueling their own trucks.
Absolutely. You're right. The only benefit from this that I see is that more CDL drivers will be available. So, if they're still trying to hire CDL drivers to run their own trucks or run their own equipment, there'll be more available, because these guys, most of these CDL drivers won't leave the industry. They're just going to decide they can either work for themselves, or they can't work for a small firm that's going bankrupt. They want to jump to a bigger firm, or they want to jump to construction. So that'll be one of the positive aspects of it. But it's a situation that's developed. We haven't really seen a lot of other folks. I really haven't seen anybody talking about it, but just going back in my history books, I remember the 2008 period. So
Keith, quick question. So I've heard you say this a few times, even just in this PioneerCast here, but we talk a whole lot about leaders leading on, right, and leading through and forging forward. But what's interesting is here a few weeks ago we talked about Ukraine. You just mentioned it. We talked about maybe a minimal impact on raw materials, metals, etc. We just covered trucking and how those impacts are going to affect those independent trucking companies and truck drivers. What's interesting is we're asking leaders, and leaders are going to have to continue to lead on through this. And there may not be massive long-term shifts, but it's these little blurbs that leaders have to lead through. Um, Even though these aren't massive price increases or big delays, it's still causing a disruption to supply chain and short-term costs.
Yeah, exactly. You and I talked about, we're going to do another podcast about recession risk, because now if you watch financial news, and that's what the discussion is right now. It's what everyone wants to talk about, is the recession risk. And you and I have looked at the data. I've shown it to you, and we think that recession risk is still a ways off. But it kind of looms. And construction, and along with transportation, are two of the industries that probably blow through this particular one without a tremendous amount of impact. As we've said for a long time, we said 2022 was go time, right? And I still believe it, even though there may be some delays, because we couldn't have anticipated two black swans on top of each other, impacting the supply of materials. We really thought that this year, this is when suddenly we were going to have steel trusses, and that suddenly those supplies were going to be available, and people are coming back into the workforce at a slow rate, but they're coming back in slowly. And then you throw two more major global supply chain disruptions right into the mix, and it just screws everything up. It just pushes it back. And so as a leader, it is important, that they be resilient, that they understand how to stay up on what's happening in the marketplace, remain flexible, but know that there are a lot of companies out there that have no choice but to conduct these projects and to expand their facilities and to be able to accommodate different types of operations. Construction and manufacturing, we've talked about a lot, up 30% year over year. And the speed and urgency to continue to reshore manufacturing operations in the U.S. should push any of this, should push construction right through any kind of a recessionary period. We've just got to get the global supply chain fixed, and then I think a lot of this really pans out. It really smooths itself out.
Excellent. Totally. All right, Keith, sounds good. Thank you so much for the update, and quite frankly, for some off-the-cuff commentary on the recession. We've been monitoring that for those of you who tune in quite often to the PioneerCast. We'll probably give you some sort of a Pioneer IQ response to that here in the next week or two. Just wanting to continue to watch the trends and not be overly reactive to that. So, Keith, thanks for the update. Again, we're praying significantly for the folks in Ukraine, and again, more so than ever, leaders that are out there running design and construction companies and teams, we know what you're going through. We're supporting you, and we're here for you. So we'll just, again, encourage you to lead on. Thanks, Keith.
You bet. Thanks, everybody.